October 12, 1884. Martha carried the first bale of wool up the slope. It was heavy, greasy with lanolin, and smelled of the flock it had been sheared from a month prior. Below, the narrow valley of Providence Gap held its breath in the cold, clear air. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the cabins, thin and straight against a pale sky that promised an early winter. Her own cabin, the one she had shared with Samuel, was among them. Its chimney was cold. She did not look at it. She looked at the dark opening ahead, a narrow fissure in the granite face of the ridge. The deed, signed by a land agent who thought her a fool, had cost her $5. An abandoned prospecting hole, he'd called it. Useless. She had paid him in coin and walked away without a word of explanation. The hound, Blue, watched her from the base of the trail. He whined, a low note of uncertainty, but did not follow her onto the loose scree. He understood thresholds, and this one felt wrong to him. Martha set the bale down just inside the entrance, where the air lost its sharp edge and took on the deep, still cold of stone. She went back down for the second. No one below understood. Not yet. She heard their talk when she went for supplies. She saw the looks from the men gathered at the smithy. Owen, who had known her husband, had been the most direct. He spoke to the storekeeper, loud enough for her to hear. A cabin takes a man's strength to keep tight. A hole in the ground takes more sense than that girl has left. She bought her sacks of flour and salt and did not answer. The words were just weather. They could not touch the work. The work was all that mattered now. By dusk, she had moved 6 bales inside the cave. They formed a strange, soft wall in the darkness. She did not bring a lamp. She knew the cave's dimensions by touch, having spent the last 2 weeks clearing it of debris and the nests of pack rats. She ran her palm over the rough, cold granite of the back wall. It was dry. That was the first requirement. She made her way back to the entrance, the air growing colder with each step. Blue met her at the trail's bottom, pressing his head against her hand. She walked back to the cabin. Inside, the air was stale. Samuel's cup sat on the mantel, its handle turned to the left, just as he had left it. Her own was beside it. She did not touch his. She opened a ledger on the table. The first page was blank, save for the date she had bought the cave. On the second, she wrote today's date. October 12th. Moved 6 bales wool. Outside temperature at dusk, 41 degrees. Inside cave, rear wall, 48 degrees. She closed the book. The numbers did not judge. They did not offer pity. They were simply true. The system that had failed was built of logs and confidence. Samuel had built their cabin according to the accumulated wisdom of the valley. He used the best timber, felled and seasoned himself. He spent a full month chinking the gaps with a mixture of clay and dried grass, his hands raw and cracked from the work. It was a good cabin, everyone agreed. Tight and square, with a great stone hearth that could take a 4-foot log. It was the same design as every other cabin in Providence Gap. And it had killed him. Not with the sudden violence of a falling tree or a flash flood, but with a slow, methodical theft of warmth. The previous winter had been the worst in memory. The cold had come down from the north and stayed for 3 months, a solid, unmoving mass of air that froze the marrow. The great stone hearth consumed wood at a terrifying rate, but the heat went straight up the chimney. 10 feet from the blaze, the air was arctic. The chinking shrank in the dry cold, opening 100 tiny mouths that breathed in the frost. He had spent his nights patching them, his days cutting more wood, his body growing thinner and his cough growing deeper. The cold found him in his sleep. Martha had woken to a profound stillness, the fire dead, the silence in the cabin a living thing. The doctor called it lung fever. Martha called it a failure of design. She would not use the same system again. Her grief was a quiet, cold engine, and it demanded a different kind of work. The cave was the opposite of the cabin. The cabin fought the cold and lost. The cave, she reasoned, did not need to fight. It was already a part of the earth, which held a deep, constant temperature. The problem wasn't keeping the cold out, it was keeping their own small warmth in. She spent the rest of October preparing the interior. She hauled flat stones from the creek bed, one by one on a crude sledge, and laid a level floor. She mixed clay and sand, packing it into the gaps until the floor was a solid, smooth surface. She did not touch the walls. Their uneven surface was part of the plan. Her mother, Helen, watched from the cabin doorway, her face a mask of quiet concern. At 70, she was frail, her hands knotted with arthritis, her breath short in the autumn air. It was for her that Martha worked. The memory of her mother huddled by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned and still shivering, was as sharp as the memory of Samuel's final stillness. "It is a great deal of work, child," Helen said one evening, her voice thin. "Owen says you are trying to live like a badger." Martha was cleaning clay from under her fingernails. "Badgers survive the winter," she replied, and that was all. The fireplace was the heart of the system. It could not be like the hearth in the cabin, a wide, hungry mouth that gave fleeting, radiant heat in one direction while pulling cold air in from every crack behind it. She needed something that stored heat, that released it slowly and evenly into the small space. She had seen a drawing once, in a book from back east, of a masonry stove. It was a tall, complex thing of brick and tile, with a winding path for the smoke to travel inside its mass before it exited the chimney. The hot gases heated the masonry, and the masonry then heated the room for hours after the fire was out. She had no bricks, no tiles. She had stone and clay. For a week, she did nothing but draw plans in the dirt floor of the cave with a stick, erasing them with her boot and starting again. The design she settled on was simple and squat. She built a small firebox from the hardest soapstone she could find, a material known for holding heat. Above it, she constructed a second chamber, and routed the flue path in an S-shape through a dense mass of river stones and clay. The entire structure was a solid block, 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, standing against the rear wall. The chimney was the hardest part. She used carefully selected flat stones, mortaring them with the best clay, building a narrow, straight flue that rose through a natural fissure in the cave ceiling. It drew poorly at first. Smoke filled the chamber, acrid and thick. She recorded the failure in her ledger. November 2nd. First firing of heater. Poor draft. Smoke leakage at flue base. Failure was data. She let it cool for a day, then disassembled the base of the chimney connection. The opening was too wide, the transition from the stove's interior channel too abrupt. She rebuilt it, narrowing the passage to increase the velocity of the escaping gas. The second test was better. The fire caught quickly, the smoke pulling cleanly up the flue. She let a small, hot fire of seasoned oak burn for just 2 hours, then smothered it and sealed the firebox door with a flat stone. She placed her palm against the outer wall of the masonry block. It was barely warm. Disappointment, sharp and cold, settled in her stomach. Perhaps Owen was right. Perhaps it was all folly. She banked the entrance with a heavy canvas sheet and went back to the cabin for the night, the failure heavy on her shoulders. The next morning, she returned with her mother. Helen was shivering in the sharp air, her shawl pulled tight. Martha pushed aside the canvas. The air that flowed out of the cave was not warm, but it was not the biting cold of the outside. It was still. Inside, she led her mother to the stone heater. She placed Helen's hand on the clay and rock surface. It was radiating a steady, gentle warmth, like an animal sleeping. Helen looked at her, her eyes wide. "The fire has been out since yesterday," Martha said. Her mother kept her hand on the stone. A small, slow smile spread across her face. The wool was for the walls. The granite of the cave was a perfect thermal battery, but it would draw heat from any warmer object next to it, including a human body. Living against the bare rock would be like sleeping on a block of ice. She needed to create a barrier, a layer of still air and insulation that would separate their living space from the cold mass of the mountain. Before hauling the wool, she had spent a week setting a framework of slender pine poles inside the cave, anchored to the floor and ceiling. The frame stood 6 inches away from the rock walls, creating a cavity. It was into this space that she began to pack the raw, unwashed wool. The lanolin, she knew, would help repel any dampness that might seep from the stone. It was tedious, dusty work. She tore the fleeces apart, fluffing the fibers before stuffing them tightly into the gap between the frame and the rock. The cave filled with the rich, animal scent of it. She started from the bottom and worked her way up, ensuring the packing was dense and even. When she finished the walls, she stretched canvas over the interior of the frame, tacking it tightly to the poles. The result was a room within a room. The interior surfaces were no longer cold, damp stone, but taut canvas walls, soft to the touch. The space was smaller now, a snug chamber no more than 12 feet square, but it felt protected. The final and most critical piece of the design was the entrance. A simple door, even a heavy one, would not do. Every time it opened, the precious warm air would rush out, replaced by a flood of cold. She extended the entrance into a short tunnel, using more pine poles and packed earth. At the end of the tunnel, she hung a heavy horse blanket. A few feet inside that, she built a proper, tight-fitting wooden door. The space between the blanket and the door acted as a cold trap, an airlock. Any cold that slipped past the blanket would be stopped by the door, and the exchange of air when entering or leaving would be minimal. Owen saw her building the tunnel. He stopped at the bottom of the path, shaking his head. "You bury yourself alive, girl," he called up. "Stone sweats in the cold. That wool will be a wet, stinking mess by January. You're building a tomb of mud and rot." Martha did not look down. She was testing the airflow at the base of the new door with a single strand of wool from her pocket. It hung perfectly still. She recorded it in the ledger. November 10th, insulation and airlock complete. No discernible draft at door seal. The community's wisdom was built on the reality of their drafty cabins, where dampness was a constant battle fought with roaring fires. They could not conceive of a space that was both sealed and dry. Her system was designed to create its own stable climate. The gentle, constant heat from the masonry stove would keep the interior air above the dew point, preventing condensation. The wool and the space behind it would manage any moisture from the rock itself. It was a closed loop. It would work. It had to. The logistics of winter required as much planning as the shelter itself. A warm cave was useless without food, water, and fuel. Her strategy for firewood ran contrary to all local practice. Everyone else kept their wood in a separate shed, a good distance from the cabin to prevent the spread of fire. Martha knew that bringing frozen, snow-covered wood into a warm space was inefficient. It wasted heat drying and thawing the logs before they could even burn properly. She used the new entrance tunnel as her woodshed. She spent the last 2 weeks of November hauling split, seasoned oak and hickory up the slope, stacking it tightly along the tunnel's earthen walls. The wood would be kept dry, and it would acclimate to the cave's temperature before it was ever brought into the living space to be burned. The pile grew until it filled the tunnel, leaving only a narrow path to the inner door. For water, she found a small, reliable spring 50 yards from the cave entrance. It ran even in the hardest frost. She bought 2 large barrels from the cooper, sealed them with pine pitch, and placed them just inside the inner door. They would be filled every few days, a task that would be difficult in deep snow, but not impossible. The water inside the cave would never freeze. The main chamber was for living and sleeping. The deeper part of the cave, beyond the masonry heater, became her larder. The temperature there was colder and absolutely stable, a natural root cellar. She built shelves for preserves and sacks of grain. She filled crates with dry sand and buried her store of potatoes, carrots, and onions. Hams and bacon, cured and smoked, were hung from the ceiling. It was a fortress of sustenance, sealed against weather and pests. The day before the first snow was forecast, she moved her mother. It was a small, quiet procession. Martha carried the rocking chair and a chest of Helen's things. Her mother followed slowly, leaning on a walking stick, with Blue trotting nervously beside her. She helped Helen settle into the chair, which she placed in the spot that received the most gentle, radiant heat from the stove. She had built their beds against the far wall, raised platforms piled with straw ticks and wool blankets. Helen looked around the small, canvas-lined room, lit by the soft glow of a single oil lamp. The air was still and smelled of wool and clean earth. She ran her hand along the taut canvas wall. "It feels so quiet," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Martha nodded. She opened the ledger. November 24th, mother moved in. First fire lit. Outside temperature, 28 degrees. Inside temperature, 64 degrees. Wood consumed, 1/4 cord armload. The numbers were the only reply that was needed. The first test came in early December. A week of iron-grey skies gave way to a driving snow, not the deep blizzard of midwinter, but a persistent, biting cold that coated every surface in a layer of frost and drove the valley's residents indoors. From the mouth of her cave, Martha watched the smoke from the cabins below thicken, a sign of fires being fed constantly against the encroaching chill. Inside their shelter, the routine was placid. Each morning, Martha would build a single, hot fire in the masonry heater. She used small, dry logs that burned fast and clean. For 2 hours, the fire would roar in the enclosed firebox, the sound a distant hum. Then she would close the flue, seal the door, and the work of the fire was done. The heat it had generated was now stored in the tons of stone and clay, and it would radiate silently into the room for the next 24 hours. They ate their meals at a small table Martha had built. Helen would sit in her rocker and read from her Bible, or mend their clothes. The light from the single lamp was enough. The quiet was absolute. There were no drafts to make the flame flicker, no rattling of window sashes, no moan of wind through failing chinking. The storm was an abstraction, a thing happening in another world. Blue, who in the cabin had spent winters migrating from one drafty corner to another in a constant search for warmth, now had his chosen spot. He lay on a sheepskin rug near the stove and did not move for hours at a time, his sleep deep and untroubled. He was her most reliable instrument. One morning, Martha noticed him shift. He had moved away from the wall, closer to the center of the room. She ran her hand along the base of the canvas wall where he had been sleeping. It was cool to the touch. Not cold, but cooler than the rest of the wall. She made a note in her ledger. December 9th, cold spot detected at floor level, north wall. The next day, she pulled back the canvas near the floor in that section. The wool had settled, leaving a small gap in the insulation at the very bottom. Another failure of the system, small but significant. She spent the afternoon tightly packing more wool into the gap until it was dense and uniform. That evening, Blue returned to his spot against the wall and settled in without a twitch. Martha recorded the correction. The system was not perfect. It required observation and refinement. But it was working. Down in the valley, Owen told anyone who would listen, they'll be down before Christmas. No one can live in a damp hole in the ground. He did not know that inside the cave, the air was so dry Martha had to keep a kettle of water on the stove to add a bit of moisture to the air for her mother's comfort. January brought the blue norther. It was a name for the storms that were more than just snow, storms that carried the solid, elemental cold of the Arctic down across the plains. The sky turned a strange, luminous grey, and the temperature fell 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind rose to a steady, high-pitched scream. For 4 days, the world outside the cave disappeared into a churning vortex of white. Providence Gap was paralyzed. No one ventured out. The sound of axes stopped. The only signs of life were the plumes of smoke from the chimneys, torn apart by the gale as soon as they appeared. Inside the cave, the rhythm of life did not change. Martha made her morning fire. The stove took in its meal of wood and exhaled its heat into the stone. The ledger entries were stark. January 15th, blizzard, day 1. Outside tempest, -10 degrees. Wind severe. Inside temp, 66 degrees. Wood consumed, 1/4 cord armload. January 16th, blizzard, day 2. Outside tempest, -15 degrees. Wind unabated. Inside temp, 65 degrees. Wood consumed, 1/4 cord armload. The wind was a distant, roaring surf. It scoured the rock face above them, but not a whisper of it penetrated their shelter. The airlock at the entrance did its job. The tons of earth and rock that surrounded them were an absolute shield. There was no rattling, no howling, no sense of a fragile wooden wall being the only thing between them and the storm's fury. The silence inside was the most profound evidence of the system's success. Helen slept soundly through the nights, her breathing even and deep. During the day, she read, her fingers nimble enough now that the arthritis had eased in the steady warmth. She told Martha stories of her own childhood, stories Martha had never heard before. The small, warm space seemed to unlock memories. Martha listened, mending a pair of socks, her hands moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm. She felt no fear. The anxiety of the previous winter, the constant, gnawing worry about the woodpile, the drafts, the creeping cold, was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet confidence in the numbers in her ledger and the steady warmth of the stone at her back. She thought of Samuel, of his frantic, losing battle against the cold in their cabin. He had fought the winter with fury and sweat. She was surviving it with physics and forethought. The storm did not matter. The numbers were all that mattered. The system was holding. They were safe. The loss hadn't disappeared, but the guilt was finally gone. The storm broke on the 5th day. The wind dropped, and a blinding, silent sunlit world was revealed. The snow was drifted halfway up the sides of the cabins in the valley. A profound quiet lay over everything. By midday, Martha saw the first sign of movement. A figure on snowshoes, struggling up the path toward the cave. It was Thomas, their nearest neighbor, his face rimmed with ice, his expression grim. He had likely drawn the short straw, sent to check on the 2 women everyone assumed had frozen in their hole. Martha was outside, clearing a path to the spring, when he arrived. She simply nodded to him. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. "We saw no smoke," he said, the words coming out in white puffs. "We feared the worst. I only make a fire in the morning," she said. "It is not needed now." He stared at her, then at the cave entrance, a dark hole in a mountain of white. He clearly did not believe her. He expected to find them huddled and frostbitten, if he found them at all. "My wife insisted I check," he said, his duty compelling him forward. "May I?" Martha stepped aside and held back the canvas flap of the entrance tunnel. Thomas stepped into the relative dark of the wood store, then stopped before the inner door. Martha opened it. A wave of still, warm air washed over him. His expression shifted from grim duty to utter disbelief. He stepped inside the living space and stood motionless, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight. He saw Helen, sitting in her rocker, a book in her lap. She smiled at him. He saw the hound sleeping peacefully. He saw no fire in the stove, only a kettle of water letting off a faint steam. He walked over to the masonry heater and placed his bare hand on the stone. He held it there for a long time. Then he turned and looked at the wood stacked by the stove for the next morning. It was a small pile, barely an armful. He knew he had burned 10 times that amount in his own cabin just to stay alive the night before. Martha watched him without speaking. He was processing information that contradicted a lifetime of experience. He ran his hand along the canvas wall. "Is it damp?" he asked. "No," she said. He walked over to the small table where her ledger lay open. He leaned over it, reading the columns of dates and temperatures. He traced the lines with his finger. Outside, -15. Inside, 65. He read it 3 times, as if the numbers might change. He straightened up and looked from Martha to her mother, who was watching him with a calm, patient expression. He seemed to finally understand that the evidence before him was real. He turned back to Martha, and his next question had nothing to do with engineering or temperature. "Does your mother wake up cold?" "No," Martha said. Never that result ended any argument. Thomas did not stay long. He mumbled his apologies for intruding and made his way back down the slope, his movement slow and thoughtful. He did not need to say much when he returned to the valley. The facts he carried were more powerful than any story. A warm room with no fire. A handful of wood for a day's heat in the heart of a blue norther. An old woman sitting comfortably while the rest of the valley shivered and burned through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. The numbers from the ledger became a legend, passed from man to man at the store, at the smithy. -15 outside, 65 inside. The math was simple and undeniable. For the next week, there was a steady trickle of visitors. They came not with pity, but with a quiet, professional curiosity. They were practical men, and they recognized a superior system when they saw one. They came to measure. They brought their own thermometers to verify her readings. They inspected the construction of the stove, tapping the stones, running their hands over the mortared joints. They examined the wool-packed walls and the design of the airlock entrance. Martha answered their questions with facts, never with feelings. She showed them the ledger. She explained the principle of thermal mass. She let the system speak for itself. Owen came on the last day. He did not come with the others, but alone, at dusk. He did not ask permission to enter. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, and simply looked. His gaze took in every detail, Helen dozing in her chair, the small, neat stack of wood, the utter stillness of the air. He walked to the stove and laid his calloused palm against it, just as Thomas had. He stood there for a full minute, his face unreadable. He looked at Martha, a long, searching look. He did not apologize for his mockery. He did not praise her ingenuity. He just nodded, a single, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned and left. The next week, Thomas began hauling soapstone and clay up to his own cabin. 2 other families started digging into the hillsides behind their homes, looking for stable ground to build insulated cellars. No one called it Martha's method. No one gave her credit. The knowledge simply entered the community's bloodstream, spreading quietly, adopted by practical people who cared about results, not provenance. Her vindication was not in their words, but in the sight of their sledges, heavy with the materials for a better way to survive. They were learning from her failure, and from her success. Spring arrived late, with a slow, grudging melt. The snow receded from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the pale, flattened grass of the previous year. The sound of running water returned to the valley. It was time to move back to the cabin. The cave had served its purpose. It had been a womb of warmth and safety through the long, dark months. Martha opened the inner door and the outer canvas flap, letting the fresh, damp air and the bright sunlight flood the entrance tunnel for the first time since November. The air that came in was still colder than the air inside their shelter, but it carried the scent of thawed earth and new life. They moved their few belongings back down the hill over the course of a day. Helen, stronger now than she had been in the autumn, walked without her stick. Her winter in the steady, draft-free warmth had been a tonic. The cabin felt vast and hollow after the snugness of the cave. It smelled of dust and disuse. Martha opened the shutters, and sunlight streamed across the wooden floor. Before they settled back in, while Helen was sweeping the porch, Martha went to a small, sea-worn chest that had sat unopened in a corner of the cave all winter. It held Samuel's things. She had not been able to look at them before. The sight of them had been inseparable from the memory of the cold, of the failing cabin, of her own helplessness. She lifted the lid. Inside lay his whittling tools, a half-finished carving of a bird, his worn leather gloves, a book of poems with a pressed leaf marking his place. She picked up the gloves, the leather mold to the shape of his hands. She ran her thumb over the smooth, worn wood of the unfinished bird. She did not weep. She felt a profound, quiet peace. The objects were no longer emblems of a fatal failure. They were just his things. The system she had built was not for him, but it was because of him. It was her answer to the cold that had taken him, a final, silent conversation about how to build a world that holds its own warmth. She carried the chest inside the cabin and placed it at the foot of her bed. Later that afternoon, she took 2 cups and set them on a flat rock in the sun warming itself by the cabin door. She went back inside and took Samuel's cup from the mantel. She washed it carefully, then brought it out and placed it beside the other 2. 3 cups, warming in the April sun. From inside the cave, now just a dark opening on the hill, she could almost hear the echo of the winter's silence, a silence that had saved them.